We have 4 papers. However, there's been a slight change to the agenda. Nick Ross, who is the advertised speaker, is not here. So first so Marcus is going to do 2 talks. He's going to go first and last. He's going to step up. So we've upgraded. Bonus, 2 Folsons for the price of 1. The first paper is called Routine Activity Trajectories by Marcus Felsen and Mary Eckert. Marcus is going to present. He's a young scholar from Texas State University. He's developing something called the routine activity perspective. I'm not sure if it will catch on. And then he's going to talk again later, kindly introduce to some of his recent thinking about why crime has been declining in this area. That's the addition to the agenda. And I'll introduce Andrew after Marcus has talked.
Okay, thank you. I think the mic is on. This is from the book that Mary and I have co-authored, the 5th edition of Crime in Everyday Life, which is just out. You should be able to order a copy if you're teaching a class. We won't be back for 5-6 weeks, but I will send copies to people if I can. Okay, the problem, adolescents are sporadic, and the published trajectory studies make them look organized. And this is accompanied by mathematical smoothing. Now, a trajectory is really, the term implies that if you shoot a mortar or a cannon in the air, it will have a smooth trajectory as it goes down onto the ship or the enemy or whoever it is, and so a trajectory should be smooth. We have all kinds of criminologists who tell us that adolescents as offenders have a smooth trajectory. In fact, this is not the case, and it is an illusion that comes from mathematical smoothing. That's the problem. For example, let's say this is a real person who happens to be caught a bunch of times, and this is what they do. You find a curve to smooth that out and make that person look like he is or she is not sporadic. Then you throw in some human cleansing with more boring people with fewer activities. Then you smooth that and get a better smooth trajectory that gives an illusion of smooth change. Then you pull out multiple trajectories ex post facto that make it seem like there are different groups of smooth people and predictable people. Voila. And so it's neat and perfect, and it's not very close to reality. In reality, teens are sporadic, and there's interesting work that's not yet been published but has been presented as a meeting by Frank Veerman, Pamela Wilcox, and Chris Sullivan, where they studied Kentucky teenagers, grade 9, I believe. Every 2 weeks they re-interviewed. And what's so fascinating is that teenagers act like teenagers. And that means that every 2 weeks their relationships change. Less than half have the same relations and the same networks. A lot of them break friendships, then they have new friendships, and so their patterns change. And also, most of the time they're not violent, but those who are, if they have anything violent or any exchange, it tends to change and tends to be uneven. And the most stable thing is 0. All else is unstable. So we have this problem. Is there any defensible trajectory? Is there any regularity we have in teenagers and youths changing over time? And we need to, the best way to deal with this is to look at time spent near peers, away from parents. So I would advertise our 1984 paper with Felsen and Gottfredson, which looked at time spent by teenagers over generations, and it was, and in that we argued that the time spent is the key way to look at it. A host of work by Wayne Osgood and others has verified that time teens spent with each other, absent adults, is when they get in trouble. Work that I've done with Andrew Lemieux, who is here and on this program, has also shown that the risk of victimization is highly concentrated. Okay, this is a reworking of the Peterborough data, Vikstrom 2012, Vikstrom et al., which shows that unstructured peer activities have many times more risk of offending hour for hour. I had to rework these data by taking pages 330 to 331 and putting the data together, but here we have very strong effects. There's also this leads us to what we would do for how we would give a smooth trajectory, the routine activity trajectory. Here's the theory, but the theory is closely related to observed data. Time spent with peers, but absent parents, increases steadily from early to late adolescence, and then it finally peaks. And the peak may decline if there are partnerships. So if you have a girlfriend, you spend time with the girlfriend and not with the other, not with the peer group. You may be away from parents, but it's not with a whole peer group. And this is the basic routine activity trajectory. And this trajectory, I argue, is smooth. That the events that occur may be sporadic, but it is the time spent that it creates the exposure to risk of offending and victimization. Now, this is consistent with the Peterborough data, which shows truancy rising and parental monitoring declining rather smoothly as adolescence moves along. So sure enough, time spent with peers, but out of parental supervision grows steadily over the teenage years. Specific events, such as breaking into a house or stealing something and getting caught, are sporadic, but the general time use pattern is smooth. So the exposure to risk is a smooth increase in exposure, but the actual events are not smooth. So to say that there is a trajectory does not make sense for crime and delinquency, but does make sense for time use. So what we're doing is we're taking a view that is in the literature that is sort of true and sort of intuitive, but isn't really right, and we're finding that underneath that intuition is something correct that you can say if you turn to the time use patterns. Okay, now, let's think about an adult viewpoint. The adult preference is that my kid, when he turns 16, will spend maybe a month or two with peers away from adults. Maybe we'll be a little bit bad, and we'll get over it at 16 years old and 2 months. So there's only a tiny little period in which my kid will be bad or will be exposed to risk. That's the adult dream, the adult preference, at least among Americans. You tell me if that's true in your country. The adult nightmare is that the early adolescence, a teenager will begin, or even at 11, will begin to escape parental controls, to be among other peers, and that will continue until age 20 or 22 with all of this exposure to risk. Now, what's interesting about this comparison is that you can have teenagers, if the teenagers on the other side of the tracks, the poor kids, fit the Plan B more, and the middle-class kids fit Plan A more, or a little closer to that, they can be the same kids. They can get in trouble similarly at age 16, but on the other side of the tracks, they might have a much longer exposure to risk for many more years in which they're not under adult dominance. Okay. Now, what you need to evade adults is you need youth convergence settings, places, hangouts. You need places to go when skipping school. You need things to steal. You need crime opportunities. You need hangout opportunities. I resisted Ron during the prior session putting my hand up and saying, what about hangouts? Hangouts are important places for teenagers to hang out away from parents. And it's not just places, it's also time. You need time spent, extended time away from parental interference, so you know adults will not get you in trouble, not turn you in, and you can evade rules. Okay, now I'm losing. I don't have a watch on me. How am I doing? A clock on the wall, so I have no excuse. Did we start late? We started on time. Couple minutes. Okay, I'll be real fast. We know from the hotspot work that crime hotspots are unevenly distributed, and not just the other side of the track has more hotspots. We know I drew a little area of social breakdown, and we find that it's much more concentrated than we used to think, and much more limited and much more overlap with middle-class areas. Now, here's a drawing of perhaps the other side of the track that has railroad yards, abandoned properties, commercial land use, where and so on, where it's easier for juveniles to escape parental and adult control, whereas in a fully residential area where nothing's abandoned and nothing commercial, it's easier for parents to control the situation. And of course, the lower your income, the more likely you'll be on the left and not the right. Okay, now the other thing I'll mention quickly that we find dramatic, the only data I've seen that shows a cusp in all of criminal justice. There's a sharp cusp in the distance traveled to major crime, particularly violent crime by single year of age, that there's a dramatic increase until age 20 in the distance youths go, and that sharply declines after age 20. And that is relevant because basically we find we find that adolescents escape parental control increasingly in their 20s, and this may be particularly true for middle-class kids, but for the poorer kids, they may be able to do it at a younger age before they have access to automobiles and so forth. Now, our 5th edition has a whole chapter on all of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcus. I should have started early by saying I'm thrilled to be here in Stockholm, and I'd like to congratulate Ron Clark and Pat Mayhew on receiving the Stockholm Prize this year. And I'm thrilled to see that a lot of colleagues who I know from other conferences have made the effort to come here to honour them as well, including Marcus and Andrew. Thanks, Marcus. Next up we have Andrew Lemieux, who is co-authoring a paper with Elvira Brewer. They both work at the NSCR in the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement. And they're presenting a paper assessing threats and devising prevention strategies, the role of situational crime prevention in tiger protection. For those of you who don't know, Andrew has an interesting background. He did his PhD at Rutgers University, but he now works, as well as in the Netherlands, he spends a lot of time working in Africa, in Uganda, with park rangers, trying to do work to prevent animal poaching on the ground. So, here's Andrew.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to be presenting some work I'm doing with a master's student named Elvira, who's here passing out some handouts. I knew Marcus would love it if I had handouts today. So we've got some interesting things to talk to you about, specifically after this conversation that was just happened on the stage up here, where you had a member, a practitioner of sorts asking, how do you translate situational crime prevention into my world? And what we're going to talk about today is a project I'm running under the NSCR's Wildlife Crime Research Initiative that came out of two things happening. First of all, at ASC this year, we had an author meets critic of a book that I edited, and Ron made a great comment. He said, it's good that people are looking at situational crime prevention and its applicability to wildlife crime, but the biggest failure we've had is empirically testing whether or not it works, a comment that really hit home with me. That was combined with a large tiger conservation NGO reaching out to me and saying, We think situational crime prevention would be great to help us protect our sites. However, we don't know how to really implement it. And what we're going to talk about today then is just that. How you can take criminological theory and practice and translate it down to a problem that is very different than we've traditionally applied SCP to. And the problem here is tigers, okay? More importantly, the near extinction of them, whereby in the last 100 years, we've gone from 100,000 to 3,200 left in the wild. There's more tigers in captivity than there are in the wild. Okay, and the threats, the main drivers of all of this are, there's about 4 of them. Poaching, of course, for tiger products. Human-tiger conflict, which definitely doesn't look like this, but this is an example. Prey depletion, whereby people are overhunting the tiger's prey. And habitat destruction. Tigers are only left with 7% of their original habitat. Okay, so these are the multiple problems leading up to the decline of the tiger. And what we want to ask in Elvira's thesis and the collaborative work we're doing is, can SCP be used to prevent tiger killings? And today I'm going to tell you something, I'm going to talk to you guys about something we're calling TTAP, which stands for Tiger Threat Assessment Protocol. I also want to make it clear that you could do this for any species. Again, you need to be problem specific. You could do ETAP for elephants, RTAP for rhinos, but because we have links with a conservation organization related to tigers, we're going to talk about tigers today. TTAP is a form that we've designed that sort of draws from the problem analysis module you can find on problem-oriented policing website. But the idea here is give a form that helps people really describe their problem, because of course they know their problem, but they need to put it down to make it easier to identify the solutions. So it starts off with general things about, the area that you're trying to protect, vegetation, whether there's communities around, are there roads going through it, all of this, just general site information, as well as how many law enforcement officers do you have, and what sort of threat monitoring systems are already in place. Are your rangers on patrol collecting data? If so, how is it collected? Do you have a hotline to report poaching? If so, is it working? So it starts off with general site information, and it's followed up by specific detailed descriptions of each of these 4 threats that I just described to you. So poaching, human-tiger conflict, prey depletion, and habitat destruction. To save time, and because I'm more interested in discussing this with you guys than I am about going through the entire form, I just want to give you a brief example of something you might find in the poaching section of this. So, okay, first of all, is poaching a threat at the site? It's always assumed that it is, but is it really a threat? How many incidents do you have a year? How are they poaching these animals? Are the poachers locals or foreigners? And what's happening to the tiger products after they've come out? Okay? Again, simple, straightforward things that should be easy for a game warden to fill in about his site. But the idea here is it starts to structure the thinking around what is your problem? Just as Ron was saying, I can't prevent crime, but I can prevent problems. We need to get specific. And what I want to do today is tell you about 2 sites where we put this in, sort of to exemplify how situational crime prevention can work, but how it's not this one-size-fits-all policy for tiger protection. So we have 2 sites. One is a subtropical dry forest of about 500 square kilometers, which is home to 5 tigers. Now imagine a large NGO investing tens of thousands of dollars to protect just 5 animals. And you would think that'd be quite easy, but 500 square kilometers of dense forest, of forest, is very difficult to patrol. Moreover, tigers can't call the police, so if there's a problem, you have to find it yourself. Site 2 is slightly different. It's a tropical rainforest of 600 square kilometers that have 7 tigers. Now, when we ran through TTAP with these 2 sites, key problems in Site 1, mainly human-tiger conflict. No poaching, human-tiger conflict. Why? Because locals are using the forest to collect firewood, and when they go in there, the tigers are there, and then things happen. Okay? Another big problem that they identified was that even though there's a buffer zone in which they're supposed to be sharing revenues with communities, it's not really working. So the community doesn't realize any benefit economically from the park. Again, tigers are dying, but not because of poaching in this area. Compare that to Site 2, where active poaching is a major threat to the 7 tigers that are there. Moreover, you have low prey density because locals are hunting the prey for food. You have foreign encroachers who go in to collect gaharu, which is a wood that has fragrance that they use in perfumes and soaps and things. And while they're there, well, if I'm looking for Gaharu, why don't I set a snare? So they're doing two crimes at once. And then another thing that was identified was corruption within the law enforcement organization there, and mainly sort of lack of motivation or not following up on things. So, two sites, tigers dying in both, needing protection in both, very different problems. How does that translate into SCP? Well, we won't give you all the examples here because many things would fit, but we thought we'll show you some. So in Site 1, strengthens formal surveillance. They have patrollers going out there, but what needs to be done is you need to increase patrol coverage and start using intelligence-led patrolling, whereby you use your data, you analyze it, and you direct your patrols into areas of concern. Part of TTAP 2 isn't just about which techniques you could use, but also how can you define that they're being successful. Getting back to Ron's biggest concern, empirical tests of SCP. So we're defining success here is that indeed you would have more areas covered by patrols, and over time, fewer encounters with poachers. Let me also say that the clear and the obvious indicators of whether these things are working or not would be increase in tiger population, as well as fewer poaching incidents, okay? But to help these managers on the ground think even better about the individual techniques, you'll see our definitions of success are a bit more specific for each technique. Also at Site 1, because of the human-tiger conflict, we talk about avoiding disputes and reducing temptation. Help them improve their livestock management, okay, and effective compensation programs so that if they're bringing their cattle into the area or nearby the area, that they know how to control them well to keep tigers away, and if a tiger does kill one of their animals, that they're paid immediately for it. There are compensation schemes in place in this area, but as I've noted in the problem slide, they're not working well. Also at Site 1, we could talk about assisting compliance. You know, people need firewood. They don't have gas stoves. They don't have electricity. They need wood to cook on. So rather than saying, this is a national park, stay out, knowing that they're still going to come in, you can offer them maybe a memorandum of understanding or agreements on regulated collection of resources. How does this also prevent human-tiger conflict? Well, you could put it in designated zones so that they're not going in collecting wood where tigers are actively prowling, basically. So Site 2, remember, completely different set of problems. Also, Site 2 is very different because it has a heavy tourism industry inside of it. So one of the techniques we recommend for Site 2 is to get the tourist operators involved. They're sort of eyes on the forest that aren't related to law enforcement. And this goes back to another thing that was a topic that was touched on, is whose responsibility is it to protect an area? Is it just the police, or is it also people benefiting economically from an area? So we talk about using place managers to increase surveillance in a way. When it comes to strengthening formal surveillance, rather than having them patrol more, which is obviously always important, in this case we're talking about strengthening the law enforcement units themselves through anti-corruption programs. And we define success here in that you're going to have more follow-ups on tip-offs than you're having currently, a higher percentage of follow-ups to encourage these guys to go out and do their job instead of taking kickbacks from poachers. We're also talking about reducing temptation in that site by farming Gaharu instead of having it collected in in protected areas. Okay, because you can farm this stuff, and if they're going in there for that wood, why don't we farm it outside? Therefore, you don't need to go in there anymore for the wood, and that means you also won't be setting traps in your Gaharu farm because there aren't tigers in your Gaharu farm. One of the biggest things when you're working in conservation in areas that are, very remote and very underfunded, there's some considerations that come up that are important for when we're talking about applying SCP into these areas. The first one at the top of the list is tiger safety, and that may seem strange, but some people want to say, the way that we protect tigers is we put GPS collars on them, same with rhinos, whatever. Well, 30% of the time when you put a tiger down, it dies. So putting collars on them to protect them, you may end up killing more than you're saving. Okay, so tiger safety needs to be thought about. Budgets in these areas are very low. Okay, the budgets are always not enough, even in urban areas, but here they're extremely low. Manpower, access to vehicles, things that if you want to increase patrolling, is it real? Do you have enough rangers? Do you even have vehicles to move them around? Jurisdictional issues. A lot of people would assume that national police force is in charge of taking care of a problem like this, but it's not true. You typically have a wildlife authority who has jurisdiction inside the park. However, the roads that go through the park are the authority of the National Police, and anything outside the park is also the National Police or maybe the military. So when you're talking about controlling access to facilities, which I didn't put up here, but you could, setting up roadblocks may not be possible, or it's going to require that you have the National Police collaborating with the wildlife authorities. So it's something that's a bit, jurisdictional issues always come up, but it's significant in wildlife issues. Corruption, staff motivation are always going to be there, because if a tiger's worth $50,000 and you make $100 a month, somebody gives you $1,000, that's a lot of money. Okay? And finally, ethics. And the ethics portion of this is really talking about some of these interventions that people talk about that are effective. For example, a shoot-to-kill policy, increasing the risk, right? If you're found inside the park, we have the right to shoot you. Technically, it works. It's shown empirically that it has helped save the elephants and rhinos. But ethically, it's a slippery slope when you start telling people that your life is worth less than an elephant's. So that's a big consideration that needs to come into any sort of SCP intervention and design. In essence, what you're trying to do is make the animal valuable to everybody. Because typically what's happening is it's only valuable to a small percentage of people who aren't the ones being affected by the problem. How are we going to move forward with this? I just want to say that I'm hosting something called Tiger Week at the NSCR in the middle of July, where I've got top experts coming in for a 3-day workshop to focus solely on this. Designing an empirical research agenda for tiger protection. Based, a lot of it will be on law enforcement techniques, but a lot of it also will be on SCP, which will be good. Because the organization I'm working with has 10 sites in 6 different countries, and we're hoping to start testing this in a few of them. But we also need your help. And Elvira's passed around a little handout that has the techniques we've come up with, but we thought what better place to get advice and ideas about more techniques than here, at a symposium dedicated to SCP. So if you're interested, feel free to fill it in, give it back to us, email it to us, but ideally we want to have a great list of interventions that we can offer these people and that we can test and prove if they're working or they're not. I'll leave it with questions and just thank you very much for the time.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, my name is Farrell. Before I start, I'm going to tell you actually, this is my first Stockholm criminology symposium, but I have a previous experience with the Swedish Council for Crime Prevention, which Gloria Laycock will remember. I think it was 1995. A large contingent from the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention visited the Home Office. And Gloria, Paul Ekblom and I did a presentation for them. Just the 3 of us to the large group from Sweden. And I talked about repeat victimization. And when we'd finished, they brought us some gifts, which was very nice. And there was 2 small packages and 1 large package. And they were wrapped, and we didn't know what they were. And Gloria and I got small packages, and Paul Ekblom got a large package. And I opened mine, and it was a small piece of glassware that said the Alfred Nobel Memorial Glassware. And just 20 years ago, I felt like I got the Nobel Prize. And I have this piece of glassware that still stands in my office. And then Gloria got the same. Paul Ekblom got what looked to me like the IKEA catalogue. And of course it wasn't. It was a beautiful book about design of Swedish furniture, which is Paul's thing, design. But that was my previous experience with the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention. Today I'm going to talk about crime trends and the influence of acquisitive crime relating to drug use. And there's a link in many ways to the panel I am on tomorrow morning in here, first thing, with Nick Tilley and Andrew Mackie-Saloni, where we're going to talk about the role of security in the crime drop. And today I'm going to talk about the illicit heroin use hypothesis that's been raised in relation to crime trends in the UK. To what extent did acquisitive crime to fund illicit drug use cause the crime increase of the 1980s and the the crime drop of the 1990s and the 2000s. The context for this is a report that came out last year. This is one of the main influences by Nick Morgan, that estimated that this acquisitive crime to fund illicit drug use accounts for up to half of the 1980s increase in crime and up to perhaps a third of the decrease in crime. And I'm going to come back to that later. Is that Nick over there? Hi, Nick. Hopefully we can get a beer or a coffee and talk as well before we go. So the background is trends in crime in the UK. Acquisitive crime peaked probably in 1992, actually. This is the British Crime Survey, but it captured crime in 1991 and 1993, but recorded crime shows acquisitive crime peaked in 1992. Property crime and acquisitive crime is the bulk of overall crime, with violent crime peaking slightly later. This is the police recorded crime data, which shows how crime peaked in 1992. If you look at that, it looks like, this is from 1950, so it shows the long-term trend of steadily increasing crime, which, to follow Marcus Felson's routine activity theory, is almost certainly due to the spread of crime opportunities in various ways through society, far more consumer goods to steal, changes in routine activities and movement patterns in ways that facilitate crime, providing new opportunities, the interaction of people working in different areas in different ways. I'm going to look now just at how crime increased. So I thought if illicit heroin use, it also includes crack use, but I'm going to refer primarily to illicit heroin use. If it did cause an unusual increase in crime in the 1980s, we ought to be able to see that visually. And there does appear to be a slight decline in the 80s and then a rapid increase later on. So I thought I'd try and tease this out. And by let me just go back, cutting the data off and just looking at the increase up to the period before 1992 from 1950. So I cut the data off just before it started that last increase in 1986 and tried to predict what the trajectory of crime would be. And it actually turned out that I thought if there was an increase due to illicit drug use, it would go above the predicted line. But crime seems to have continued pretty much along the same trajectory. This is theft and handling of stolen property and burglary. They do predicted lines based on crime up to the mid-1980s. And then if you put back in the crime as it actually turned out, in fact, I was surprised myself to find it's actually below the predicted line. This is a prediction line. This is very crude. But just as a first thought, I expected it to be significantly above the trajectory from crime since 1950, which obviously wasn't that due to any sudden increase in illicit drug use. So then I looked at the UK's main source of information on crime, which is the British Crime Survey. This is data from the British Crime Survey on the proportion of the population using illicit heroin or crack in the last year. The British Crime Survey, now the Crime Survey for England and Wales, is a self-report survey. It started asking questions of respondents on illicit drug use in relation to 1991. The methodology changed slightly over time, but it's still roughly comparable, I'd say. I'm not going to have time to go into the details. And the Home Office was very modest in its early reports because drugs and the self-reporting of use of drugs is a very controversial issue. The report about 1991 crime didn't get released even until 1995. The reports that contain the data for 1993 and 1995, when it came to crack cocaine and heroin use, simply show an asterisk, a star, for the prevalence of use because it was below 0.5%. So to some extent, I've joined the lines from 91 to 96, but I think it's fair because reports by Malcolm Ramsey described it as fairly stable over this period. And we see here, this only shows from 1991 then, which is just before crime peaked. But which also incorporates all the time when crime's been declining. Now, self-reported use of crack cocaine and heroin peaked in the year 2000 and has declined somewhat since then. If you look at if you look at just powder cocaine, which is not crack, but just for a bit of context, that had been increasing even more rapidly and more consistently over the period since 1991. This is all adults 16 to 19. The 1991 survey, age 16 to 59. The 1991 survey, I believe, was adults aged 12 to 59. That's the methodological difference. One of probably the UK's leading academic expert on the illicit heroin trade, illicit heroin use in the UK was Howard Parker. He wrote an excellent book in the 1980s called Living with Heroin that I read not long after it came out. And then did a series of follow-up studies. There was an epidemic of heroin use, particularly in the Wirral part of Merseyside, in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s he was writing about a second wave of heroin and how this increased. And in 2004 he wrote that as the UK enters the new millennium, he wrote this, with the complex and serious drugs problem, the re-emergence of heroin in sections of its youth population is apparent. And that fits with the data from the British Crime Survey that we just saw. Likewise, Peter Reuter, who's arguably the world's leading drug policy analyst, he's an Australian who works at the University of Maryland, did some work for the UK Drugs Policy Commission, linked up with Alex Stevens. They concluded that the growing number of new heroin users each year over the entire period 1975 to 2000, on top of which was layered, starting in the late 1990s, i.e. long after crime had started to decline, the first major outbreak of chronic cocaine use. So they said that illicit heroin use continued to increase to 2000, which is what Parker said, which is what the British Crime Survey said, and that cocaine use was also a problem after crime had started to go down. So then I turn to what I think is probably the second best indicator relating to illicit drug use in the UK, which is none of the indicators are perfect. Some are better than others. It's more a case of looking for the least worst indicators. Persons found guilty, cautions, or dealt with, also from Home Office statistical bulletins. This only shows from 1994. To some extent, this is very much work in progress, and I'm taking the opportunity to present here as a chance to try and get feedback and input from other people. I'm fairly sure if you project those back in time, they simply go downwards, the curves. But they show that the steep rise was in the late 90s and continuing increases in the 2000s, with heroin stabilizing, crack continuing to increase. Fairly similar to what we've seen from the other indicators. And this is actually rather different from what Nick estimates in his study, which is published as Research Report 79, and with an accompanying technical report, altogether about 300 pages. So set aside a few hours if you're going to go through them. They were published by the Home Office last year, where he estimates that acquisitive crime to fund the illicit drug use peaked in the mid-1990s and then declined rapidly and steadily. And this is based on other indirect estimates of extent of use, and I've not had a chance to ask Nick where the indicators I just mentioned were. The main indicators, this is from the report that we used, were opiate overdose deaths, new heroin users from the Home Office Addicts Index, and the number of heroin seizures. This is from 1968 to the year 2000. I just showed you more recent data that goes beyond 2000 for drug seizures. Oh, no, sorry, for arrests and persons incarcerated. And I'll show you some for drug seizures in a minute. These all show steep increases in the late 1990s, which Nick, if I've understood it correctly, interpreted as they show an effect that's lagged from an increase in illicit drug use several years earlier. I don't necessarily agree with that, as well as the fact that when you look beyond this time period, as I just did, the trends don't agree with crime having gone down. The addicts index that's used to show the number of new heroin users there was discontinued in 1996, largely because it wasn't felt to be very good. Ramsey and Spiller, in a Home Office research study, agreed. It was Malcolm Ramsey who did the work on the second and third sweeps of the British Crime Survey that looked at drug misuse declared, self-reports by people, who said that the number of registered addicts it increased rapidly, but it's probably measuring really an increase in the availability of treatment. Arguably, the increase reflects the expansion of treatment services, especially those for those dependent on heroin. Certainly, the BCS tells a different story, as we just saw. And he was writing this in 1997. Now, if we look at more recent data on seizures, if you remember that rapid increase there stopped at 2000. So this is more recent information showing how seizures, if they are an indicator of use, and they're a limited indicator, seizures by customs and other law enforcement, like policing, will reflect police activities as well as trafficking trends. But they don't show the decline that you might expect from the mid or early 90s onwards. In fact, they're increasing generally with a slight decline in heroin. That, in fact, very much mirrors the trends shown in the British Crime Survey on self-reports. That was the number of seizures, an even starker contrast in relation to the quantity seized, where heroin continued to increase dramatically until 2001 and has declined steadily. Again, very much mirroring the pattern in the self-report studies. Drug seizures, as I say, are not perfect. This is a quote from DrugScope, which was an independent think tank and expert body in the UK that actually closed down in March, saying drug statistics are helpful, they're imperfect, and a more reliable source is the British Crime Survey, the Crime Survey for England and Wales, but they do provide some information. So I want to challenge Nick's work, and Nick's going to present tomorrow morning, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk some time. Because I wasn't convinced by the extent of the indicators that were used. I thought they were quite limited, and they seem to me, in this first look, from what I can tell, to conflict with the British Crime Survey and Crime Survey for England and Wales measures of the extent of drug misuse, the measures of the Home Office measures of persons found guilty, cautioned or dealt with. I haven't showed you here today the trend in the global illicit opiate trade, but the opiate trade, the production of illicit heroin from Afghanistan has continued fairly steadily across the 1990s and 2000s. It doesn't agree with the trends we just saw in seizures after 2000 or the interpretation by key commentators. So as far as I could see, there doesn't seem to be the quantifiable evidence of a decline in illicit heroin or crack use that may have induced the drop in crime. And it appears that illicit heroin use, crack and cocaine use continued to increase after crime declined, or at least was stable. It's a difficult area methodologically, studying drugs, and Nick's study is excellent in the way it covers a huge amount of literature and addresses many of the methodological issues. Bennett and Holloway, Trevor Bennett, again, another expert, he published a chapter on the rational decisions of opiate users in the Clark and Cornish classic on the reasoning criminal. Trevor Bennett, Bennett and Holloway, in a recent review, noted that acquisitive crime in the UK has fallen dramatically, but, and they said, this is their words, it is a leap of faith to assume that this means that drug-related crime has also reduced over this period, and they offer other possibilities. So, as we saw, since the 1950s, crime has increased. I couldn't identify off the top a significant major change in the trajectory. It's also clear that for 30 years before a 1980s heroin epidemic and 1990s illicit heroin use, that crime had increased dramatically and was continuing to increase. And as I mentioned, the other second main conclusion is that increased illicit heroin and crack use to at least 2000, the year 2000, doesn't seem to coincide with the crime drop. Thank you. Now we're going to have a second dose of Marcus Felton.
Okay, this is a bonus talk, or if you want to consider it that. Oh, wait, I got to, how do I do this? Hold on a second. Hold on, how about this? How about that trial and error? Okay, this was the talk I gave at Stockholm University last week, and since Nick Russ canceled, I offered to do it today. I gave it in an hour there, but I only have 15 minutes now, so I have no idea what's going to come out. If you walk out on me, I will not be offended. Some of you, the Swedes in the room, some of them may have heard this, and I'll understand if you walk out. In fact, I'll understand if anyone walks out, but I'm doing my best. Okay, first of all, we have the old statistical adage that you can't prove a hypothesis false. You can prove a hypothesis false, but you cannot prove it true. And that's especially true for explaining changes over the decades. You can describe what's happened. What you learn from your description may show that a hypothesis about change is false, but you can't absolutely prove that what you think is the cause of the change is true. Okay, now here's the basic prosperity trend in modern societies. I'm drawing a broad general notion that from 1947 to about 1980, most of our economies had more prosperity. Then it started to decline some in terms of everyday prosperity. And we can argue which indicator, we can find different timing in different countries, but that gives a basic idea. Now, I took that and reversed it for the blues, economic blues. You see it's blue, and it's the same kind of a thing where the blues declined until they didn't decline anymore and started to maybe increase some. So that's a broad outline of the economic changes. Meanwhile, the major trends in street crimes, I put quotes because some of them aren't right on the street, but what we normally think of as the standard burglary, robbery, assault, so forth, that those increased until sometime around maybe 1980 when they started to zigzag some and then they declined. And this timing would be a little different from one modern society to another, but that gives you an idea. Now we have some decline that seems to be somewhat sustained over a few years and quite a departure from the prior pattern. Okay, now, meanwhile, we've got the cybercrime, relatively new, accelerating, dramatic, not well counted, but in other words, we don't have a central depository that tallies them, but we know there's a dramatic increase. Now, what cannot work as a theory? Crime rates trends cannot be caused by economic troubles because it just won't work. We can't say that it's bad economy that produces more crime. By the way, I'll tell the Europeans, many Europeans in the room, that the American criminologists said for many, many years, what we need is a social policy like in Sweden, and our crime rates will go down. And the problem is that as Sweden's social policy unfolded, and also in other European countries, their crime rates went up just like ours. That argument, and also economy, just the economic arguments that poverty and increased economic troubles will cause more crime just didn't work. It's not a measurement error. There are too many alternative sources in different nations that show the street crime trend. There's not a proof of a better world. If that were the case, why would your data not show that? Why would the cybercrime be increasing so dramatically? So we don't seem to have this great better world and a brave new happy world where everybody is good. Okay, now it's not a displacement to cybercrime because of the timing. Now, Ron has done so much for so many of us and taught us so much. And I'm trying to use a new word that maybe it's very hard to add something to what Ron Clark has done because he's done so much, but I'm going to try. If we say supplementation versus displacement, that there is supplemental time. It's an idea I've learned from Ron, that there are new crimes that come out, but that doesn't prove they were displaced from the old crimes. The timing and arrival of the cybercrime occurred too late, accelerated too late to be displacement properly understood from the other crime decreases. There's some overlap in offender profiles, but often they're different offenders. So I would call that a supplementation, not a displacement. Okay, now there's some people have come up with these relative deprivation theories to try to explain the trends in crime, and the problem with these theories is all you need is a numerator and denominator, and you keep fishing around until you find some sort of a curve that fits the crime curve, and then you say, voila, we've proven it's relative deprivation. But there is no one relative deprivation theory. It keeps morphing until it can fit. And so it's not really science. It's ultimate unfalsifiable theory. And so I simply brush aside all the relative deprivation theories because they just keep changing and they're not replicable and they're basically fudge theories. Okay, now we know that crime's a tangible phenomenon. You know that argument by now. Changes in products, activities, households, everyday life. You know about the crime triangle. And you know, many of you, maybe you don't know about William F. Ogburn, who was an outsider in the Chicago school, but emphasized inventions and technology and how it changed life on Earth. One of the points I make sometimes people trained like me originally in sociology is because Ogburn said the nuclear bomb, examine how each invention affected life on Earth. He talked about nuclear bombs changing life on Earth. Would we say that because that's not a sociological or psychological variable that the nuclear bomb isn't important for changing life and society on Earth? It isn't one of our variables. Well, I think maybe we should include it. Okay, culture does not change fast. We find a lot of evidence of that, and I'm going to skim over that, go on to how many of the theories that work over space do not work over time. For example, there are spatial differences in race and crime in the United States, but percent black doesn't change much in the U.S. over time, and it just can't explain the crime rate trends, so it's kind of silly to dwell on that. Now, the other person I'd cite is Adolphe Quetelet, the Belgian, whose social physics emphasized tangible aspects of society. And I borrowed a slide from Anchorage, Alaska, from Troy Paine, who showed the dramatic the difference between summer and winter in the crime rates, which shows, by the way, on the top tier of the earth, including Stockholm, including in Sweden, where there's dramatic increase in crime in the summer and decrease in winter. It doesn't seem that the culture changes among Swedes and Northern Europeans. Their culture changes completely from winter to summer, or they're genetically different, or they're the same species. Swedes are the same Swedes in winter and summer, but the crime rate increases dramatically in the summer, and we got to say, wait a minute, isn't this something about the tangible way of life? And more evidence of that. Okay, now we got our crime quadrupling. There's the product life cycle, which Leroy Gould noted, whereas products are new, people don't steal them, they don't know how to use them, then they start spreading and people start getting interested, you get accelerated crime rates. Then finally there's a saturation and the price comes down and people stop stealing those products as much. And so we have product life cycles, and this is evident in some of our crime rates. We've got lightweight durable goods, you've heard that argument, and household structure. But there are some changes in household structure. Some of our British friends have pointed out that the windows have improved, and the double pane glass makes it harder to break in. Nick Tilley and Graham have noted that. And these are the U.S. trends in double pane glass, which makes it harder for burglary. So a lot of these changes are very inadvertent. Intellectuals tend not to like this because it's not a deep meaning. It's not deep changes in the soul of society. It's very tangible kinds of things that make it harder for burglars to burgle. By the way, I want to pay tribute to the British. Americans don't say burgle, but burgle is the simpler word than burglarizing. Okay, now this is something I discovered only recently, that not only is there an increase in people working at home at least in the US and I think in other countries. I knew that, but when I looked at the statistics in detail, I discovered that the people working at home are the older workers. The younger workers don't have clearance to work at home. They don't have the seniority. So the ones going out to work at the office are younger than the ones who are working at home, at least some days a week and often the whole week. So that we've got this aging of population in the neighborhood who are hanging out and doing their work at home. So it's very interesting to see this changing age structure in residential areas, partly due to working at home. We also have a shift of households in the U.S., and I've seen similar data in other countries, where the 18 to 24-year-olds are typically living in their parental home. We call it the cluttered nest. And that means that has a double effect. They're not in their own apartment and subject to victimization more, and they provide another guardian of their parents' home. Now, I'm not watching the clock. How bad am I doing here? Okay, so we've got these societal changes and adaptations, and you know about the car design that make cars harder to steal. And all this is another one. The cash, we know there's a dramatic decline in the use of cash. We know that makes a difference for a lot of crimes. It makes a difference for robbery, because if people don't have cash, there's no point in robbing them. That means robbing stores, robbing individuals. That means burglary is less useful because you break in a house, there's no cash there. They don't have cash in the drawer. They may have some jewelry. So there's still reasons to break in, but less than there was. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is not only is there less cash, but the transaction amounts per cash payment are much different. For example, people use cash for for 2/3 of transactions under $10, they use cash. This is I think this is U.S. data, and I'm forgetting already whether this is the U.S. or the U.K. So I'm sorry, I forgot to put that down. When it's $10 to $25, we're already below 50% using cash, and as it's bigger amounts, it goes down. So that means that, yeah, some people still use cash, but only for smaller amounts. So how much you need on you? How much do you have in your wallet? And what's the point in robbing anyone if the amount of if they have very little cash anyway? Okay, technology changes shopping. 2/3 of our shoppers in the U.S. browse online and buy in the store. Not only are more of our sales online, but when you shop at the store, you make fewer trips to the store. You go online to figure out what you're going to buy and make one trip to the store to pick it up, if you go to the store at all. And so our theft at the doorstep increases. There are people who follow the delivery trucks around and steal things. But the theft the theft from the store changes. The theft of your car while you're at the mall changes because there are fewer cars there. The risks change because the daily patterns change. Okay, this is not going to the shops. The percent doing online retail, this is UK data, dramatic increase in online retail sales, fits the same pattern. And the amount of travel in vehicle miles traveled per capita peaked. This is American data, Americans are supposed to drive everywhere. Well, they're not driving everywhere for shopping, errands, recreation. It's declining, the amount of vehicle miles. Now, I think we have a shift in substance abuse in the U.S. There's decreasing use of alcohol, but no decreasing stable rates of marijuana, and maybe increasing. I have a couple slides that sort of show this. There's one, there's another, that's the alcohol. So what I think is happening is that people are, basically drinking less alcohol, particularly underage, but they're smoking as much pot. And I think the pot gets them in less trouble as far as being violent or aggressive or something of that sort. So they're a little mellowed, more mellow, less likely to get in fights, less of that problem. And also, I think there's a decoupling of marijuana and alcohol. It used to be people would have a few drinks, have a few more drinks, then they'd smoke a little pot. I don't think it's happening. I think they'll smoke a little pot without the drinks. And they'll not be getting drunk, but they'll be a little high. It's not that they no longer intoxicate, it's that they do so in ways that are not as dangerous from a crime viewpoint. I'm not saying it's good for health, but I think there's a shift in the substance abuse pattern. Okay, and we have one of our points here is that small changes in technology can produce big changes in crime. We've got the arms race point that Paul Ekblom has made, and I translated it into Swedish that small changes in technology can bring big changes in crime. To thank the Swedes for inviting us here, and there we are. And the Swedes here will know that that's who that is next to me. A famous Swedish poet, songwriter, Evert, and I would have talked to him if he were alive. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Marcus, and thanks, Marcus and Andrew, for being brief. We've got plenty of time left for questions, which I'll try and moderate if there are any. Yes, so we'll go first. Yes, please. I don't know if we do have a microphone. Great. So when you raise your hand, and I'll try and keep track of people, and then wait till the microphone comes around. Can I ask that people say who they are with a brief introduction first?
I'm Professor Dorothy Newbury-Birch from Teesside University in England. I was interested in what you were saying, Marcus, about alcohol use decreasing amongst young people. Because what we know in England is that alcohol use and the amount of alcohol when using is decreasing amongst young people. But we know it's increasing amongst people from about 35 to 50, so middle-aged people, particularly middle-aged women. So we're seeing a change in substance use and in England. And I think, whereas that's a good thing for young people, I really worry about how this is portrayed as alcohol use reducing, when actually we've still got a massive problem in England, but we have a problem with a different group of people now. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, my take on it is, first of all, from a public health viewpoint, is different than a crime viewpoint. The middle-aged women are not as much of a crime threat. They may be a victimization threat, but they're less of a, overall you worry the young get in more trouble, so any reduction in the young drinking will reduce the crime, but that doesn't mean the other changes are good. One of the things I think we find is that that bad comes from good and good comes from bad, that the notion that all the bad things go together or all the good things go together over time clearly does not work. There are new problems that emerge, they cause have new consequences, and so your example is important. But the other thing we keep learning over and over again, but have trouble persuading people, is how much crime is incidental to other changes. How crime is not a deep phenomenon, it's a shallow phenomenon much of the time, most of the time. And if there's anything we learn is that that crime rates can increase greatly for reasons that have no deep meaning. For example, if a Walmart or a big store, big box store opens in your town, your crime rate's suddenly going to go up by 200-300%. I remember when the computer printers got much lighter, there were new models came out, and I was telling everyone, these are now going to be stolen. You couldn't carry the old printers. Now you can carry these off, and sure enough, but it didn't show in the statistics. The way I verified it is I called around to local detectives, and I asked them, are computer printers being stolen? And they said, yes, they are, only recently, but they are. And so that we don't even have our statistics designed to pick up the way the society changed, the way how many of the changes occur. I want to give a little quick comment that I think that forcible rape has been approached by many people wrongly, that the way to understand forcible rape and to design policy, this is my, I'm grabbing this moment to me, is to think about the half hour prior to the rape, the trip home from the party or the bar, and who women went home with. Did they have a way home? And was there a guy who attacked them on the way home? And that half hour period is the key period. And anything that changes that half hour period is going to increase or decrease forcible rape. And trying to get people to be so tangible and down to earth and practical about crime is difficult because they're so morally outraged they can't do analysis.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, this is Joel Miller from Rutgers University. I really enjoyed all the panelists. Thank you very much. I had a couple of questions for Andrew, actually. I was pretty riveted by what you were talking about. But I guess I had a sort of follow-on, couple of thoughts. So one, and it's a really ambitious and very impressive kind of idea and vision that you have. But I did think, especially on the back of some of the comments this morning, in the earlier session, one of the, big questions I had is the kind of implementation aspect. So how do you go from this big idea to sort of creating incentives on the ground for stretched, kind of resource-poor rangers and other sort of government officials, perhaps with competing incentives, particularly given the backdrop that you mentioned in one of the sites of corruption? How do you kind of make that happen? I know that you don't have there's no quick answer to that, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts. And I guess I've got a long list of things here, but I'm just going to try and stick with three. Second question is then, even if you're successful as a pilot, how do you then go from there to that becoming a kind of mainstream kind of strategy. And again, one of the things that sort of, for me, came out of that conversation this morning was the difference between this very intensive problem-focused analysis and response to creating broad policy, right, which you would hope on a sort of wider sort of scale would impact poaching and impact sort of the preserving of various species. Final, very minor technical methodological question: how will you know if you're successful when you only have 5 tigers? Your statistical power is pretty small. Thanks.
Okay, let me try to break those 3 up. I'll start with the last one. One of the ways, I guess I'll answer them sort of simultaneously because of the fact that for implementation, for example, this isn't some idea that I'm having that I'm going to go try to sell around there. The reason I've pursued this with Elvira is because we were approached by people who actively protect these sites. They've identified 10 areas. They fund the law enforcement. They fund any sort of research that goes on inside of it. And they came to us and said, how can we use SCP in our sites? So the implementation for some of the things, of course, will be, if it's anti-corruption, that's a bit of a difficult one. But other things that are very straightforward, so, setting up a hotline so that when the cattle gets killed by a tiger, they can at least reach these people. So the implementation phase doesn't worry me because they've already been in these sites for 3 to 5 years, depending on the site, working, training the rangers, actually giving them, it's a British foundation, so they have ex-military guys from Britain going down doing the training. So it's just a matter of adding in packages, SCP packages. So implementation in some ways would be difficult, but at least we have a foot in the door. That's very different than saying this is how we could use SCP and then going to different foundations saying, do you want to be involved? We at least have our foot in the door. Second thing is because this NGO has been in the sites, the way they started was tiger monitoring. So they set up camera traps all around these areas and they photograph, when the tigers come by, it takes a photo. And tigers have a unique pattern stripe so that you can actually, it's like a barcode basically. Every tiger has a fingerprint, that's its stripes. So now what we can start to do is at least monitor if the population's growing, which of course from 5 to 6 isn't it's going to be difficult and you're looking at very, very small number changes. So more the way to test the effectiveness of some of this is by modeling the patrol data, beyond counting tigers, but modeling the patrol data to see how illegal activity is changing inside the park over time. Even that is highly difficult because of the fact that animals don't call the police, crime only occurs in areas that you patrol, and that's a question that nobody has the answer to yet. In all my conversations with conservationists or anti-poaching people, nobody truly knows how to say if poaching is going up or down because unless you sweep an area regularly, an area that's 500 square kilometers, you don't know baseline levels of poaching. You just don't have any idea. So you have to figure out clever ways to survey an area and then extrapolate, but basically sending rangers out on random searches, that doesn't fit their job description. So they're more interested, we go where we know there's problems, and what I try to do, at least in some of the work in Uganda, which is different than this of course, is show them the areas they're not going to so that they can, if I make a crime map, crime's here, but I didn't go there. On my map, it looks like this is crime-free, but it's not. So to test the effectiveness of these interventions will require multiple indicators. And then the second one I'm trying... Oh yeah, scaling up. Indeed, so, that's why here what we're not providing is this is what you do and this is what works. We start off with the product we're selling is the assessment protocol. This is how you describe your problem. Once you've described your problem, look at our 25 technique list, see which of these will fit. The one we've asked you to fill out just has blanks, but ideally what we do is instead of having that place for you to fill in, we've created a sheet where it says, is this even applicable? And they can check yes or no. And so we're not trying to create a scale up of, you always close down your roads because just as Ron was talking about this morning, you need to know individually. So we're saying, give them the format for describing the problem.
My question is not necessarily about scaling up, roadblocks, but how do you scale up? It's like how do you scale up problem solving problem-oriented policing. It's not an intervention, it's a mentality, it's a way of doing business. And so my question, and it's not an easy one to answer, I know that, I'm just throwing it out there because it's a perennial one, rather than that there's a try answer for it. But how do you then kind of mainstream those techniques into sort of the management of wildlife? I mean, I don't think there's an answer
and that's
to that.
going to be some of this going back to if we can show using our indicators that it's working, at least offer that. Gloria is holding up a PDF I gave her. It's separate. I hate to do the sales pitch, but it's separate from what I'm doing. But I've recently established a ranger education fund for rangers in Uganda to bring them up and partake in courses, criminological courses, or anything meant to help them understand how to study the problem better. And so this year we're bringing 2 rangers up from Uganda to do spatial crime analysis in the hopes that then by learning these skills they can apply it to their problem-solving approaches. So,
great, thanks.
Yep.
Any more questions? No? Then thank you again to Marcus and Andrew. And I have no problem with us breaking early for dinner. Thank you for coming to the session.